Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Lord Lister, the Punishment of the Jewel Forger. By Kurt Matchell and Theo Blakenzy. Chapter 1. The Cheat Cheated. A carriage stopped in front of the Hotel Cecil in London, and immediately the porter was on hand to lend a helping hand to a pair of elegant gentlemen as they got out. One of them, wearing a black pointed beard, asked in English, which immediately betrayed the Frenchman what time it was. The doorman took out his watch. "It is 5:45, he replied. The stranger had also brought out his watch. "I do not understand you. Please speak French." "As you prefer," said the porter, repeating the time in this language. The stranger nodded, gave the doorman a franc, and disappeared with his attendant into the vestibule, where, again in poor English, he asked for the price of the room. Even now Raffles could hardly make himself understood, until at last one of the hotel officials, who had an excellent command of the French language, was able to converse with the lord. He took 3 rooms on the first floor for himself and his guide, and in the book of foreigners he wrote, Gaston Durand, banker from Paris, and his secretary Henry Rickald. The gentlemen went to their room, and when they were alone, the black-bearded one rushed to the door and bolted it. Then he listened to the walls, opened the cupboards, and looked out the window, as if to make sure everything was safe. He saw that his rooms looked out on the Thames. "Come here, Charlie, look, what a beautiful view. It seems that the hotelier has picked that out for Raffles." "PSS," said the other, "speak the name Raffles, never mind, I suspect the police are chasing us." The black-bearded lit a cigarette and looked at his friend. "Don't worry, we're as safe as can be. Everyone takes us for real French. And then, Charlie, you have to get used to talking about Raffles as an unknown, but most interesting person. You think people are much too bright and think that everyone in me recognizes Raffles at once. You are sorely mistaken about that. I'll convince you of your error as soon as possible, when we're on the same tram with our friend Baxter, the detective inspector of Scotland Yard. For heaven's sake, don't do it, fellow." "I sure will. You need to steel your nerves, Charlie, they are such excellent weapons in our company." Lord Lister was silent. He took another cigarette, lit it, then suddenly laughed very loudly. "I should have liked to see the inspector's face," he burst out, when he opened the telegram I sent him from Victoria Station. Charlie Brand looked anxiously at the door and listened. "What are you doing?" asked Lord Lister. "I am nervous. Very nervous. You talk so casually, as if you were sitting in your mansion in Regent Park. The walls could have ears here, quite possible. But I still believe that you can be completely at ease. I already told you that the whole hotel staff thinks us French. Before we go out, I want to inspect our false beards once more to see if everything is all right." Lord Lister put his money where his mouth is. He checked with the greatest conscientiousness of his friend whether Charlie's false beard might arouse suspicion, and then examined it within himself. Then he spoke. "Come on, let's go out. I am very much in favor of stiffening up our wallets and inviting the well-known jeweler Colgate in Holborn Street to investigate. The fellow cheated me out of several £100 sterling some years ago by selling me counterfeit diamonds. Charlie Brand made a surprised face. He knew that Lord Lister had recently donated considerable sums of money to charitable institutions, and that he himself was scarcely a few pounds rich. "If I understand you correctly," said the secretary, "you intend to buy jewels. But what would you be willing to pay for it?" Lord Lister once laughed gaily. Then with a flick of his finger he cut the ashes from his cigarette and said, "My dear boy, I never made you my counselor, but I only took you with me because a solitary life is so empty and tedious. You can leave it to me, then, as to how I will sort things out with this jeweler. And as I am not the man to put the matter on hold, I shall visit him today." Raffles saw Charlie shake his head. "Let us go," he said coolly, and he left the hotel room with Charlie. Downstairs he asked in French if letters had come for him too. He mentioned the French name he had adopted and the numbers of his rooms. The officer checked the letters that had arrived, and then handed Lord Lister some at the address of which was his assumed name Durand. When they had left the hotel and in a cab had seated themselves, "Who would take them to Holborn Street, to the shop of the jeweller Colgate," said Charlie Brand. "I am curious to know from whom you received those letters. 2 hours ago you did not agree with yourself what name to take, and now you have received letters." The Lord laughed. "Charlie, learn to stop asking so many unnecessary things, and take the things that pertain to me as they are. Here are the letters. What it contains cannot interest either of us, for they are but blank pages." Charlie Brand looked utterly amazed. "Blank pages? How do you know that? Can you see through the envelopes?" "Not that. But surely I must know what I have written myself?" Charlie looked even more surprised. "What have you written yourself? What do you mean by that, Edward?" "Very simple," came the reply. "I have addressed the letters to myself in order to inspire some confidence here in the hotel. Trust me, the hotel owner and the rest of us dare to swear that I am none other than the banker Durand from Paris. Do you see these letters?" He took out an envelope. Thereupon he continued, "They are all envelopes from companies that we visited yesterday. I then claimed that I had to send a letter very urgently and therefore asked for envelopes. This supposedly urgent letter I addressed to myself under the name Durand. The manager of the hotel, the porter and the other officials are now of course of the firm opinion that I am also known in all these firms under the name Durand. I have to be on my guard in every way, Charlie, that's part of my job. If I'm not careful, that no mortal can get a hold of me, Inspector Baxter could cut me very soon, see?" The cab stopped in front of the jeweller Colgate's business, and the two gentlemen entered the shop. Lord Lister was again having trouble with his broken English, until the gentleman spoke French to him. The stranger demanded set diamonds of the purest water. He also asked for pearls to match the diamonds, so that an elegant necklace could be made from them. The proprietor of the business, jeweller Colgate, an old, wizened diamond merchant, with whom even his colleagues disliked dealing because he was so masterly at making counterfeit stones, came out of his office to personally assist the strangers. He gave his servants a secret sign, thereby indicating that he considered the visitors to be thieves and that his subordinates should keep an eye on them. He had a large iron cassette fetched from his office, and when he opened it, the most beautiful stones glittered in the little cubicles. Using oddly shaped steel tweezers, he took a stone and clamped it with a pair of fine steel screws in such a way that it was impossible for the precious jewel to be torn loose. Then he handed the tweezers to Lord Lister. The latter examined the diamond, showed it Charlie Brand, and declared in French that the stone was of good size and that he wished to buy it. "You certainly give me some guarantee for every piece," he added. Jeweller Colgate withdrew his countenance and replied, "I'm pointing out to you that I am one of the most esteemed jewelers in England. I only buy my stones from the De Beers mine and never of any intermediary. My company only sells correct goods." At these words he had clamped in his tweezers a new brilliant, a masterly imitated false diamond, so dexterously crafted that hardly any mortal could detect its falseness. In this way, the jeweler deceived hundreds of strangers every year. Lord Lister had bought a set of diamonds from him some years ago, and had discovered a few days later that they were all counterfeit. He had then tried to compel the jeweler to pay damages, but the charges had come to nothing, and now John Raffles wanted revenge. Jeweler Colgate did not recognize his former customer in the Frenchman. Lord Lister pretended not to detect anything suspicious, and with great indifference selected a dozen stones. He was convinced that several of these were false. After the Lord had selected the diamonds, he had pearls presented to him, an article in which the jeweler also masterfully made counterfeits. The customer selected about 20 pearls and then said, "You'll be so kind as to let me take the jewels to Hotel Cecil this evening. Ask for banker Gaston Durand from Paris there, and I will pay the bill at the same time." Jeweler Colgate bowed courteously and at the same time exchanged a look of understanding with his servant. He personally led the French to the door, apparently out of courtesy, but indeed, because the strangers mistrusted him. The diamond counterfeiter was always on his guard and in the end trusted no mortal. When Lord Lister had raffled the warehouse, the jeweler said, "That is a very distinguished person or a swindler, so great as I have never seen in my life." "Well, as long as he pays, it's exactly the same to me who and what he is." He then examined all the pearls and diamonds again to see if perhaps the buyer had exchanged some of them, but came to the reassuring discovery that he had not. "I believe, Mr. Colgate," said the first attendant, "that not even handsome Raffles would succeed in cheating or robbing you." The jeweler smiled flattered. He was far from indifferent to kind words and flattery. Then he said, "You must come with me to Hotel Cecil, Mr. Bertram." It was a great distinction from the jeweler to take a servant with him on important business. Lord Lister had requested that the jewels be taken to the hotel that very evening. The jeweler saw another scam in this order, and when he was on his way with his servant, he gave him all kinds of instructions to be careful. When they got to the hotel and inquired about banker Durand, the hotel boy led them into a conference room on the hotel terrace. There sat at a small table Lord Lister and Charlie Brand. With the distinguished, indifferent calm of a high-ranking character, Lord Lister received the visit and bade them take their seats. Raffles sipped his tea leisurely, as if the whole person of Colgate was none of his business, and his opinion that he was dealing here with a crook was beginning to waver a little. Finally, after the waiter had cleared everything and put a box of cigarettes on the table, the so-called banker, the jeweler, and his servant to come a little closer. "May I see the stones and the pearls again?" he asked. "I want to convince myself that they are still the same as those I saw in your case." Colgate wrinkled his face unwillingly. The stranger's mistrust displeased him. "Excuse me, sir," he began in a high tone, "you have to do with a person of great esteem. My name alone guarantees you that no inferior stones are involved here." He didn't see the ironic smile on Raffles' face. This one replied, "Quite possible. But I take the view that there are more swindlers in the world than honest persons, and that I must first find out whether businessmen can be trusted, without relying on words or recommendations." The jeweler looked at his servant. The latter shrugged his shoulders and did not know what advice to give his superior. Colgate was in dire straits. Would he trust or distrust this man? At last he opened the jewel box and took out a stone, which he handed over to Lord Lister. The latter took a loop from his waistcoat pocket and, apparently with great knowledge, examined the stone. He handed the diamond back to the jeweler, who handed it to his servant. In this way Lord Lister examined all the stones, and he noticed how keenly he was being watched by Colgate and his attendant. An ironic smile twisted the corners of his mouth. As he took the last stone in his hand, he looked at it long and intently. Several seconds later he spoke. "I refuse this piece, Mr. Colgate, the stone is false." The jeweler became shy. He had hoped to be able to sell this counterfeit diamond to the stranger without difficulty. "Impossible," he stuttered, "you are mistaken." "Oh no, Mr. Colgate, but you don't seem to know your stones." The jeweler took the diamond and looked at it as if he were holding it in his hands for the first time. A few moments later he claimed, "You are right. I beg your apologies for this negligence. That excuse is gladly granted to you, Mr. Colgate, but you see how much right I had to express my suspicions. The jeweler was embarrassed to answer. For the first time in his lengthy practice, he had been exposed by a client. With sour-sweet countenance he took the stone, while Lord Lister examined the pearls. He also succeeded in detecting 2 false copies. Jeweler Colgate silently cursed this wholesale. "I'll buy the copies that are still missing in Paris," said Lord Lister. "I intend to go back to France early in the morning on the first steamer." "How expensive are these jewels?" The jeweler took a deep breath. "They are of the purest water, Monsieur Banker, but I will not charge you too high a price. The jewels together cost £18,000 sterling. "Very well," replied Lord Lister, and without being a little surprised at this enormous prize, he took out a checkbook and a fountain pen. In clear writing he wrote a check for the said sum, while the jeweler looked on with a facial expression as if he did not know what to do. When Lord Lister wrote down the name Gaston Durand, the jeweler began. "Excuse me, monsieur. I hear there that you will be going back to France early tomorrow. You will probably be across the channel then before the bank, which will have to pay me this sum, is open. I shall therefore take the liberty of handing you over the jewels only after I have collected the sum from the bank." Lord Lister blew out the smoke from his cigarette with a long drag. "You are right, sir," he replied, "but as I am as convinced of the authenticity of my check as you are of the authenticity of your stones, and I have no guarantee whatsoever that I shall receive the same jewels as I put them in your hands, I have a proposition to make to you." "And that is?" "Look here." Lord Lister took a silver matchbox that was on the table and shook the matches in it on the table until the box was empty. "You put in this box," he then began, "the jewels I have bought, diamonds and pearls. We will let the waiter bring us yarn, paper and lacquer. I will tie the box shut and apply a lacquer, on which I will press my seal. You can then keep it in your possession until you have received your money. Then you send it to me immediately. I tell you in advance that I will have the box opened by my Parisian jeweler, and that the seal must be undamaged. If not, I will return the box to you and demand compensation of £200. Colgate Bow. The proposition seemed very plausible to him. He kept the jewels until he had the money in his hands, and the stranger could be confident that he would receive the purchased item in pristine condition. Lord Lister wrapped the box in paper, tied it with a rope brought by the waiter, and sealed everything with 2 lacquers. Then he slipped a beautiful signet ring off his index finger and sealed everything. He handed Colgate the package. "How do you find this signet ring?" asked Lord Lister. Colgate was about to take hold of the jeweled jewel when the ring fell to the ground with a clumsy movement. He bent, as did his servant and Charlie Brand. The search lasted a few seconds, then Charlie found the ring and handed it Colgate. The jeweler had scarcely risen again when his first glance fell upon the matchbox containing its precious contents. Happy. It still stood, sealed and well, in the same place. Before examining the ring, he took the box, and Lord Lister saw him examining the seals with suspicion. But his keen eye could detect nothing suspicious and, quite pleased, he put the box in his breast pocket. Then he looked at the ring. "That is an antique ring, an ancient Roman gem. The brilliants are not set completely modern. I value this ring at £400 or £500. My jeweler in Paris," replied Lord Lister, "valued him much more highly." Colgate handed the ring back, and Lister put it back on his finger. "Here's the check," he said afterwards. "You now know our agreement." "Excellent," replied Colgate. He then said goodbye and left the hotel with his servant. As he sat in the cab with these, he said, "Unfortunately, I didn't think that Franzouz would know so much about jewels and pearls. The man was probably a jeweler. At least I'm sure of my money now." The servant coughed once. "I don't know, Mr. Colgate, but wouldn't we be the victims of some crooked trick?" "Don't get nervous," replied the jeweler. "Would the jewels still be in the box? How would they have gotten out?" Colgate carefully pulled the package from his pocket and examined the seals. "They are undamaged," he said. Bertram looked at the package with suspicion. Then he said again, "But what if they're out now? Don't be so anxious, you are indeed capable of spoiling the whole thing. If I let you lead me, I would open the package and nothing of the whole story will come out." Lord Lister, meanwhile, had paid his bill and left the hotel to take the night train to the boat. Charlie Brand didn't say a word as the pair drove through London. Lister, too, was silent. On Common Street, Raffles went to the station and took the express train to Brighton, the famous English seaside resort. When he was alone in the compartment with Charlie Brand, this one began. "I don't understand why you put so much trouble with that jeweler. After all, you never intended for a moment to buy the jewels." Lord Lister laughed. He prepared a cigarette case and held it out to Charlie. "A cigarette, boy?" At the same time, he handed him a matchbox. But barely had this in Charlie's hands when he let out a cry of surprise. He looked at the box with wide eyes. He didn't know whether he was waking or dreaming. The box Lord Lister handed him was just as packed and sealed as that which the jeweler Colgate had taken an hour before. "That's a ghost," he said. "How did you get that matchbox?" "Very easy, I put it in my pocket." "Yes, but I did see the jeweler put the box in his breast pocket." "Certainly," replied Raffles, "but not this. That was another I fixed in our room before negotiating with the jeweler. I put it on me, and when you stooped to the ring, I put it on the table and took away the box with the jewels. Look." He untied the strings and shook the diamonds in his hand. The beautiful, precious stones sparkled and sparkled in every possible color, and Charlie Brand made such a silly face that Raffles burst out laughing. "Then why did you give back to the jeweler that false stone and those pearls?" "Because Raffles prefers no lesser things, my boy, do you understand that?" Carefully he then put the jewels away again, and a minute later he was snoring comfortably in the velvet pillows. Chapter 2. The jeweler in fear. The jeweler had had a very bad night. Just before going to bed, he had read through the evening paper, which, as usual, was full of Raffles' latest pranks. For the first time, the thief gave him care and fear. He thought for a long time, and suddenly the thought occurred to him, whether perhaps that so-called Parisian banker might not be the unknown Raffles. He looked over and over at the sealed package and wondered if he couldn't open it without breaking the seals. He endured the worst Tantalus torments. Again and again he devised some means of opening the box without anyone being able to detect it. But then his thirst for gold resurfaced just as quickly, and the fear that it might finally be noticed after all, kept him from his resolve. No. He couldn't dare. He would lose too much. For the jeweler Colgate was so used to making 500% sweet profit from every sale. And whenever he lay down, when he had closed his eyes to fall asleep, like an Alp so high, so menacingly high, the figure of the banker from Paris appeared before him. That figure then gradually changed features, and the stranger whispered to him, "I am Raffles, the master thief, the great unknown." Bathed in sweat, Colgate would spin on his bolster or jump to his feet, distraught and consumed with anxiety, and he became so nervous that he would walk up and down his bedroom with a revolver in hand, looking around to see if the stranger could hide in a cupboard so that he could steal the box with its precious contents if the opportunity was right. He passed the night sleepless and kept walking up and down the room, box in hand. At last the long night had been wrestled. The morning came. He, as it were, devoured his breakfast, on which he would otherwise have spent the necessary time, and then ran to the bank. There he came to the dreadful discovery that he had left the check under his pillow. With a heavy curse he called a cab and drove home. But the check was gone. With a new curse he called the maid and demanded the check from her. The maid, a good Irish woman who had only been living in London for a few weeks, looked at her master with a silly countenance. "I must have my check," shouted Colgate, "my check for £18,000. Where is it? Where did you leave her?" Give me the paper at once. He shook the woman by the arm until the latter, a large, strong woman, knocked him back. Well, everybody. I don't know what sir means. I didn't see anything. Never mind. Then you must ask Tom, he was in the bedroom before I was. You are lying. Roared the jeweler, you lie everything. You stole the check. Give her back at once or I'll call the police. He pulled the covers from the bed and lifted the pillows, but with a crimson face with anger he looked at the empty sheet. There was nothing to be seen of a check. Where's Tom? Bring the fellow here at once. The Irishman disappeared, and Colgate heard her call to Tom. He too had been employed by the jeweler for the first time in several months. No maidservant or manservant could last long with him, as he treated every subordinate in a canine manner. The Irish woman returned a little later. Tom has gone out for a few minutes, sir. For a moment Colgate stood transfixed. Then he started mixing up the maid again. To rattle. You cursed scum. You are in cahoots. But wait. I'll be you. Confess at once that you and Tom stole the check. He had grabbed the maid by the throat and nearly squeezed her respiratory organs. But that was too much for the Irish. She kicked her master in the belly and struck him hard in the face, so that he flew back a long way. You old bum. She exclaimed, I'll show you how to treat people. And now I'm going at once. I will not be in your service for a minute longer. Before she reached the door, the jeweler was already on her feet. He tore open a window that opened onto the street and shouted in a louder voice. Help! Killers! Thieves! In a few seconds the whole street was in commotion. Tramcars had to stop because a large crowd had gathered in front of the jeweler's house. Police rushed from all sides. It was a boundless confusion, but at last the policemen succeeded in bringing some order to the boundless confusion, and when they entered Colgate's residence they soon learned what had happened. They advised the jeweler to telephone the bank immediately that the check should not be paid if it was presented by someone else. Right, said Colgate, I hadn't thought of that at all. He flew to the phone and berated the bank. The short answer was, all right, sir. One of the policemen then said, I now request you, Mr. Colgate, to come with me to Scotland Yard and give the description of the missing man there. Very well. Gasped the jeweler, the fellow must be on the gallows. He rode with one of the policemen to Scotland Yard and was admitted there by Inspector Baxter. The detective superintendent drummed his fingers nervously on his desk, and listened with only half an ear to the story Colgate was telling him. His mind was incessantly occupied with the pursuit of Raffles, and when the jeweler had told the whole story, the police inspector knew only that the visitor had been robbed by Tom. Where is Tom? He suddenly asked. The jeweler looked at him with astonishment. Where is Tom? Yes, if I had known that, I would not have come here. I hope you'll catch the fellow soon. You may go, your case will be investigated, said Baxter. Completely broken, Colgate returned to his house, where Bertram met him to express his sorrow over the incident. Be silent. The jeweler bellowed at him, you are to blame for everything. I? Asked the servant, in an offended tone. What, Mr. Colgate? How come? Snapped the chief, are you still asking? Don't you know? I have valued you way too much. Thou art too stupid to dance for the devil. Thou art the jeweler gasped. His face had turned completely blue from excitement. I beg you for clarification, Mr. Colgate, Bertram now rushed. I will not bear such insults and I will charge you. Colgate laughed furiously. All right. He shouted, just sue me. Maybe you'll find a judge somewhere who will find me guilty too. Donkey you are. Great, great ass. Triple swayed dumbass. I repeat here again, that you and you alone are to blame for everything. Everything, you understand? You made me think that Raffles was in the game. You said that that banker from Paris might have cheated me. That's why I didn't sleep all night. That's why I forgot to bring the check. Do you understand now why you are an ass? "Mister," said the servant once more, and he managed to keep himself surprisingly calm, "I will let the judge prove the contrary to you." Then he took his hat and left the shop. The jeweler couldn't stand it any longer in his house. He flew back and forth like mad, and finally ran back to the bank to ask if perhaps a cheque for £18,000 had already been presented. "No, sir," the cashier replied. Then he went for a walk through the streets of London in the quiet hope of meeting the fugitive somewhere. Just before the bank closed, he went to inquire again whether the cheque had been presented, and when he was again answered in the negative, he went to Scotland Yard to inquire with the detective Mahome whether they might be on the lookout for anything yet, used to be. Mahome laughed scornfully. "No, we have nothing yet. The cheque is, moreover, utterly worthless to Tom, as the bank does not pay him a penny on it." "Correct," replied Colgate, "but to me she is of the greatest value." "Then let that buyer write another cheque," said the detective. Colgate sighed deeply. "That's just my worst misfortune," he then declared. "The man left this morning." "Well, then perhaps I can give you a means of getting the cheque back." "Speak up, quick. I am grateful for any clue." "It is now 4 o'clock, said Mahome. "You can place an advertisement in the evening paper, giving the bearer of the stolen cheque a reward of £500 sterling. Colgate wrung his hands. "My whole profit goes to the moon," he exclaimed. "Don't you think £200 is enough?" "Possible. But in general, a high reward attracts much more and delivers the best results." Colgate thought for a moment. Then he spoke. "I will follow your advice." He hired a motor car and drove to the major newspapers to hastily place the advertisement there. When he got home, he was like broken. However, he could not sleep that night either. He thought to himself whether he should not rather open the package, but his greed held him back. At last, toward morning, he fell asleep, clutching the matchbox in his hand. It was not until noon that he awoke, as the servants had left his house and no one had awakened him. Only the doorman was still at his post. When the latter noticed that Colgate had risen, he told him that a boy was waiting for him. In anger, the jeweler summoned him upstairs. "Where do you come from?" he snapped. The boy took out 2 papers. "I have here a cheque for £18,000 and a receipt for £500. I'll give you the cheque for £500. The jeweler took a deep breath. With trembling hands he reached for the paper, but the boy, apparently well informed, held the cheque tight and said, "Excuse me, sir. I may only give you this paper if you pay me £500. "But I must see the paper," replied Colgate. "I must convince myself that this is the stolen cheque." "You can," said the boy, and showed him the paper for a moment. Colgate looked sharply at it. No doubt about it. That was his stolen property. Without further deliberation he took 5 £100 notes from his wallet and gave them to the boy, who handed him papers and receipts and quickly left the house. A few blocks away the boy entered a folk inn, where 2 gentlemen were seated at a table. He went to them, politely took off his cap, and handed the elder of the pair the £500, whereupon the latter handed the boy £10 as a reward. The boy disappeared, and the gentleman, who had received the money, said, "Come on, Charlie, we're going back to Brighton. You see how good it is to get up early in the morning and read the advertisements in the papers. I have now sent the Colgate a second cheque, from which he can get as much money as on the first." Lord Lister laughed, paid breakfast, and left the inn with Charlie Brand. At the same moment Colgate ran to the bank to cash the cheque at last. The cashier took the paperwork from the nervous jeweler, read the signature, and then handed it back to the jeweler. In a calm tone he said, "That cheque is no good." Colgate stood as if petrified. "You are mistaken," he said. "I am the jeweler Colgate, the owner of the stolen cheque. You need not object to pay me the amount. If you wish I will identify myself." "I tell you again," replied the officer, "that the cheque is not good." "But understand me," asserted Colgate emphatically, the check that has been stolen from me must be paid. I'm not paying the check, replied the cashier. Colgate grew impatient. He began to curse so that the cashier slammed the hatch in front of him. I'll go to Detective Mahome, thought Colgate, and ask him to come with me so that he can identify me. And he flew again to Scotland Yard, where, as Mahome was not present, he was referred to Inspector Baxter. After telling the latter what he wanted, Baxter agreed to go with the jeweler to the bank. The two had arrived half an hour later. When Baxter explained what they'd come for and he legitimized himself with his badge, the cashier repeated again with an ironic laugh. That check is no good. The devil can get you for my part. I must have that money, shouted Colgate furiously. The cashier shrugged indifferently. I've told you a dozen times now that that paper isn't real. We do not have the honor of knowing Mr. Durand. Colgate looked at the officer in complete dismay. A terrible thought flashed through his brain. His breath caught. His knees trembled. He stammered, I paid £500 for that check. Too bad about all that money, claimed Baxter, so that check doesn't seem worth anything. It dawned on the jeweler's eyes. He could hardly tell Baxter how that morning a boy had returned the check to him. Then the swindler has played you a second trick. Now open the matchbox that should contain the jewels. The jeweler did this. When he had removed the paper and opened the box to shake the precious stones in his hand, nothing but a business card and some pebbles fell out of it. With glazed eyes, Colgate then looked into the empty box and fainted. Inspector Baxter picked up the business card. Scarcely had he read what it said than he let it fall to the ground again, as if he had grasped a glowing fire. His face went pale, the cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He bent down and picked up the card again. At the same instant Detective Mahome approached Baxter. He saw how pale Baxter was. "Hello, Inspector," he asked. "What has happened to you? Have you caught a ghost?" Baxter took a deep breath. Then he replied, "Yes, sir, so it is. And I wish that the ghost became flesh and blood, for it is capable, as I have told you before, of driving me into the madhouse. Read this." Mahome took the calling card. It said, John C. Raffles. For several seconds he stared at this name. Then he handed the ticket to the inspector, and with a smile said, "A devilish fellow. Did you perhaps get that ticket by marconograph? I consider that fellow capable of anything." "No," replied Inspector Baxter, "it fell with a heap of pebbles from this matchbox, which was supposed to contain a number of the jeweler's diamonds." Detective Mahome gave a soft, mocking laugh. He knew the practices of jeweler Colgate, and alluding to them, he replied, "Who knows, you claim, or rather the jeweler does, that in this box he had put the diamonds which he was to send the stranger to Paris. Of course he only saw that. To the devil, Inspector, it's not impossible that this Colgate put the diamonds in his waistcoat pocket, and wanted to send the stranger the pebbles." Baxter replied, "You always make up your own mind, Mahome, but now before all else have a doctor called to assist the jeweler." Mahome left the room and returned some time later with a doctor. With his help, Colgate soon regained consciousness. When he was finally healed to the point of reasoning with him, Baxter showed him the calling card. "You've had a very notorious customer in your shop," he said, "and you're very lucky that he hasn't stolen more from you. The man with whom you have had dealings is capable of inexplicably putting all your valuables in his pockets." Colgate thought Baxter was making fun of him, and in spite of his physical weakness he replied in an angry, excited tone, "Keep your jokes to yourself, Mr. Baxter. I assure you, no thief had hitherto succeeded in cheating me for a mere sixpence." Detective Mahome laughed and claimed, "It probably wasn't worth the trouble of the thief doing business with you." Colgate threw back his head with a proud gesture. "Right, sir. My clear vision has always mastered all the crooks." "Come on," said Mahome, "the thieves have a very different view from yours. A few months ago I found a notebook with a notorious person in East End, in which all kinds of jewelers and bankers were noted in connection with nighttime visits. Your name was among the firms, too, but there was a remark made there which I would not believe if an honest commoner had made her. The remark, however, came from a man who inquires very carefully about a firm such as yours if he wishes to enter into any relationship with it, and so I take the liberty of believing all that I learned there at the time. Jeweler Colgate looked at Detective Mahome with a furious expression that has the snout of a bulldog. "May I also know," he snapped at the detective, "what that scoundrel had written in his notebook about my widely known firm as Solid?" "Well," laughed Mahome, "if you like to hear it." "Yes, I want to hear it," cried Colgate. "I will bring that wretch, if he has offended me, to trial." "Then you must wait a moment." "The spokesman has been sentenced to 12 years in a penal house for the time being," said Mahome calmly. "Don't care," replied Colgate, "though he had 13 years, if he offends me, he must go to prison." "Who was it?" Baxter now asked. "A German," replied the detective. "You may remember the break-in at the Lyric Theatre 3 months ago. Then I arrested a burglar who had fled from Germany. His name was Warrior." "And what did that scoundrel, that thief, say?" asked Colgate. "His notebook said," replied Mahome, "it's not worth breaking into Jeweler Colgate, he sells too much bend." The jeweler gasped. That was indeed too much for him. He could not get more furious than if someone dared to damage his honor as a merchant. "Hell and devil!" he shouted, "do you believe such a thug? Sir, that is a scandal. I would even like to press charges against you as a result of what happened. Only your social position will save you in this matter." Mahome shrugged indifferently. Then he reached for the business card and said, "Allow me to read to you what the John C. Raffles, aka Lord Lister, so well known to you, writes to you." "You have no right to read business cards addressed to me," snapped Jeweler Colgate. "You have not the slightest right. Give me that ticket, it's mine." "Not yet," replied the police officer. "We are not here as private individuals, Mr. Colgate, you must not forget that. I'm standing here as a Scotland Yard officer investigating a crime. And in that regard, Mr. Colgate, I have the right, and Inspector Baxter will agree, that we confiscate all papers and evidence. When the case is settled, you can get your bullets back. But listen now, what the conscious business card entails. Printed on the front: Lord Edward Lister, London, Regent Park. Below it is written in pencil: Mr. Colgate, some years ago you sold me pebbles instead of diamonds. It is now my great pleasure to remind you of the sale, which did you no harm at the time. Yours sincerely, John C. Raffles, aka Gaston Durand, banker from Paris. A black veil fell before the jeweller's eyes. With a sigh he fell into a chair and closed his eyes. "You know, Mr. Colgate," began Baxter, "that this Raffles used to be one of the foremost English aristocrats, and as such he now reproaches you for selling him pebbles for diamonds back then." Colgate supported like someone who is seriously ill. "Stop your insults," he moaned. "It seems as if I am sitting here before you as a defendant. Better find that Raffles for me. It will be a long time before we find it. But are you sure, Mr. Colgate, that this time you have indeed sold real goods?" "But sir," fired up the jeweler, "keep calm. It appears from this note that you have a special fondness for pebbles, and it would not be impossible that you were mistaken again this time." The jeweler gasped with anger. He would have loved to have knocked the inspector down with a punch. He started. I, this time did indeed give stones of the purest water." "So then you did indeed deceive Lord Lister?" Colgate turned pale with shock. He saw that he had made a great mistake, and did not know what to answer. "Leave me alone. I wish I had nothing more to do with the whole thing." "I'd like to believe that," laughed Detective Mahome. Then the jeweler sank back into the chair as if broken, and closed his eyes with a weary gesture. "Now leave the man alone," said Baxter, "and go to your post, Mahome." "Very well, Inspector," replied the detective, and with a curt greeting left the room. But after he had gone, Baxter went to the jeweler and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Colgate, it might not go so well for you." Colgate rose and shook hands with the inspector gratefully. "I thank you for those words," he said in a tearful tone. "I thank you. And if I can be of service to you, I am willing to do so. Are you married? Then come to me and pick out a beautiful diamond brooch for your wife. I assure you that you will get fine quality, and you will do me the pleasure of accepting such a small present from me." Again the jeweler shook his hands with gratitude to the inspector, when suddenly a savage scream was heard at the door of the room in which the two were. Baxter yanked open the door to see what was happening and saw that Detective Mahome and a police officer struggled to keep Tom back. "Stand still," ordered Mahome, "or I shoot." Colgate immediately recognized his escaped servant. "We have Raffles," the agent exclaimed. "Don't talk such nonsense," shouted Mahome back, "stand still." He tried to put the handcuffs on the fellow. At that moment the jeweler rushed at Tom to seize and beat him by the throat. So he pulled Mahome back. Tom got free and so punched his former master in the face that he spun backwards on the ground and dragged the detective into his trap. Because of this confusion Tom managed to flee into the street. Mahome now cursed Colgate. This one scolded the detective. It was a terrible confusion. People had also become aware in the street, when the fellow came rushing there with a heathen noise and a great roar, and across the street, in front of the window of a large cafe, two gentlemen sat watching the riot intently. It was Lord Lister and Charlie Brand. The two sat there calmly at a table and had just dined most deliciously. Lord Lister followed with great interest all that went on in the street. There was something enticing, something tantalizing about the proximity of the danger. But Charlie Brand was not so calm. He swung back and forth in his chair with nervousness. He would rather have been miles away from this place now. "Let us go," he begged his friend. "Why?" asked the latter. "It is the same whether we are here or elsewhere. A shelter cannot save the fugitive, but cold-bloodedness can. But it's teeming with detectives here. All the better. The more there are together, the more one leaves the work to the other, the less they find the one they seek. That is my practical experience. The gentlemen now think us quite differently. And please don't make me nervous." Charlie Brand looked at Lord Lister with admiration. John Raffles never seemed to lose his composure. But Charlie looked with anxious eyes at all the noise in the street and at the fleeing fellow. Suddenly Lister said, "Look, Charlie, there in the street, there's our friend Baxter and jeweler Colgate." Charlie Brand looked out. He also saw the intended gentleman. Baxter stood alone for a while, after the others had already left. He seemed to be thinking about something. Then he entered the cafe, where John Raffles was sitting with his friend. Charlie Brand turned pale. "I believe," he whispered, "that the inspector is coming in here. Why shouldn't he? The man will be hungry. We should have left here. Don't be so childish." But Charlie did not keep his eye from the door, through which Baxter, a few moments later, entered, accompanied by a gentleman. The two sat down not far from Lord Lister's table. Charlie Brand sat on hot coals. Then an icy shiver ran down his spine as Lord Lister smiled at him, lit a cigarette, and told a joke in a loud voice. Some time later, Baxter had ordered his soup and seemed engrossed in serious conversation. Raffles said to his friend, "Now get up and leave the cafe. Wait for me on the corner in the cigar shop." Charlie stood up. With trembling knees he put on his overcoat and left the room trembling. On the street, the greatest fear came over him again. If Lister was recognized, he was a lost man. Raffles, meanwhile, looked at Inspector Baxter with the greatest composure. With an indifferent gesture, as if nothing and no one interested him, he smoked a cigarette and slowly drank his cup of coffee. Baxter, quite accidentally, looked several times at the bar-goer who was sitting just opposite him, and suddenly the Lord noticed that the detective's eyes were resting on him inquisitively. John Raffles didn't even blink, and kept his eyes out perfectly. He saw Baxter leaning forward and saying something to the gentleman who sat by him. This one, too, looked on at Lord Lister, who had not for a moment let go of his indifferent demeanour. The two over there, however, continued to whisper, and then the inspector stood up and pretended to look for a magazine at the reading table. Then he walked from the reading table with a few hasty steps to the door and out onto the street. Yet Lord Lister noticed that the inspector was watching him. He saw that the detective who had remained seated did not lose sight of him for a moment. Immediately he realized that Baxter had gone out into the street to call in relief troops, and without a moment's hesitation he went to the men's room. A narrow window led from here into the courtyard, and through it he fled. With a small jump he got down, then he climbed the fire ladder and came to the roof. This was flat, and he saw that he could proceed without any danger as far as the corner house. There he stopped his walk on the roofs, opened a hatch and came to the stairs of a house. He had left his hat in the cafe. Understanding that he could not show himself in the street without a headdress, he listened at several doors until he discovered one behind which, in all probability, there was no one. With a protruding walker he opened the door and entered the house. Several hats and caps, as he had suspected, hung in the hall. He hastily put on one of them and then disappeared as he had come. Now he went down the stairs and into the street. It was completely filled with an excited crowd. "They have him." It sounded on all sides. "He is captured." It was in that cafe that the Scotland Yard detectives caught him. Lord Lister laughed ironically and entered the cigar shop. However, his friend had disappeared. The Lord bought some cigars and then asked the shopkeeper where the gentleman had gone, whose appearance he was describing. He hastily left when it was called outside that Raffles had been captured. "Thank you." Lord Lister went away. He moved among the crowd. Maybe that's where he discovered Charlie Brand. When his efforts were in vain, however, he took an automobile and ordered a drive up Fulton Street to Miss Walton's house. He had given up this house to Charlie Brand in case the friends got separated. He got out near the house so as not to cause a stir in the quiet street. It was on the corner of St. George's Street. He looked carefully around the half-dark street to make sure the house wasn't guarded by detectives. He did not notice that a fellow, apparently a beggar, had been watching him closely and giving secret signals to a shop opposite. As soon as Raffles entered the door of the house, several detectives emerged from the shops across the street, including Detective Mahome. Careful as Indians, they crept forward. "Watch out, boys," whispered Mahome. "If you are good at your post, the fox will be trapped today." He stopped at the door of Miss Walton's house and listened intently. On the fourth floor a door opened and the voices of Miss Walton and Lord Lister could clearly be heard. "Two men must go to the roof," said Mahome. "Two must keep watch here on the stairs and one goes in the courtyard and one at the front door. I'll go in with Detective John and try to get him. If we have to fight, I will give a signal. Well taken care of. I finally want to uphold the honor of Scotland Yard. All of London is laughing at us." He examined his revolver and went up the stairs. When Lord Lister pulled the bell at Miss Walton's house, the young lady opened the door herself. Lord Lister called his name softly, and then a beam of joy appeared in the girl's eyes. She led him into the anteroom and there said, "Lord Lister, get out of London as soon as possible. All the detectives are persecuting you." John Raffles laughed. He ignored her words and asked, "Is your mother at home?" "No. I have sent her to the sanatorium for a few weeks so that she can regain her strength." At the same moment there was a shout. The girl listened. Then she spoke. "Who could be there?" Lord Lister replied, "That will be Charlie. He knows he can find me here. But let's be careful, and first ask who's there." Again there was swearing, this time louder than before. Now Raffles was startled. That commanding tone came from someone who demanded access at any price. He flew to the window and looked through the spy to see who was standing outside. No sooner had he seen this than he went back into the room. "I am being persecuted. There are several detectives down there." Miss Walton turned deathly white. Distraught, she looked at Lord Lister. Desperately she wrung her hands and whispered, "You are lost." "Be calm," whispered Lister. "Where there is a will, there is a way, and my will is strong enough to find a way. I have not a moment to lose." He opened one of the windows. The girl rushed after him. "No, Lord Lister, you must not do that, it would kill you." Lord Lister stood for a moment indecisive. There was no other way out for him, only through the window could he flee. Suddenly he let out a soft whistle. He had found what he was looking for. Under the window a narrow ledge led to the next house. If he could get past that, he could go through an open window into that strange house and reach the street. But the room was on the 4th floor, and if he misstepped, he was bound to fall to the ground. He was already about to embark on the journey when he saw that detectives had also lined up in front of the neighboring house. So there was a full hunt for him. And now he was caught in a trap from which he could not escape so easily. John Raffles's brain was working with feverish haste. He had to find a way out. Without exchanging another word with Miss Walton, he hurried into the kitchen to survey the chances of escape from the window. No sooner had he opened a window than he let out a cry of joy. He had found a new way out. This one, however, was of a very breakneck nature. A balcony had been fitted to the kitchen window in the English manner. A washing line had been stretched from this balcony to the house opposite. The English dry their clothes in this way, for want of a better place. Raffles wanted to reach the other house along this washing line. On this journey he was exposed to the greatest danger to life, for if the clothesline broke he would fall from the 4th floor. Before venturing into the plan, he turned to Miss Walton. "Take a good look at the Times ad page. You will read more about me there. I must see you again, Miss Walton." He grabbed her hand and kissed it. Tears shone in her beautiful eyes. He looked at her, and in that instant it became perfectly clear to him that he loved the pretty girl. He forgot that out there the detectives wished to be admitted in a commanding tone, and as he threw his arms around her, he whispered the sweetest words in her ear. Meanwhile the detectives had fetched axes. The door shattered. Lord Lister released the girl. "Farewell, dear. Don't forget what I told you. In a few days you will have a report from me in the Times." He gave her a razor-sharp pocket knife. "Now wait until I get the rope right. When I call, cut it in half." Miss Walton was shaking. "Edward," she whispered, "think what you want to do. If you fall down, I'll jump after you." "Don't worry," replied John Raffles. He kissed her. At that moment the door flew open with a loud crash. Without a moment's hesitation, Lord Lister flew over the iron parapet, seized the clothesline with both hands, and tried to reach the house on the other side. He hadn't reached it yet when the detectives got to Miss Walton's balcony. "There he is," they cried, "stop or we shoot." "Quick, Miss Walton!" cried John Raffles, and at once the young girl cut the rope. Lord Lister flew through the air with all his might and crashed into the wall of the house on the other side. The detectives looked at each other in amazement, then at the chasm that now separated them from Raffles. They took out their revolvers to fire at the fleeing man, but before they could use it the Lord had slid down the clothesline, which now hung almost to the floor and was hidden from view. Then the wrath of the detectives turned to Miss Walton. Under English law she could not be held responsible for the flight of Lord Lister. With no further concern for her, they left the house to continue the hunt for Lord Lister. Miss Walton stopped on the balcony. Everything seemed to her like a foolish, unbelievable dream. When it started to get dark, she had a carpenter called, who had to repair the shattered door for her. While this was happening, a gentleman approached her and saluted her. She was startled when she recognized Charlie Brand. He went into the room with her, and there she told him what had happened that afternoon. The girl also informed him that Lord Lister would soon be featured among the advertisements in the Times. Charlie thanked the girl for her information and left quickly. But where was he to go? He was so used to being guided in everything by Raffles that at the moment he stood helpless in the street. Then he resolved to ask an old schoolmate for lodging, until Lord Lister would hear from him again. Chapter 3. The Kidnap. Baxter had a secret meeting with his detectives to reconsider how Lord Lister, aka Raffles, could be caught. The jeweller Colgate had offered a reward of £1,000 for him who returned his jewels. But no matter how the detectives thought, they couldn't find any new means of catching Raffles. The inspector had once again met with Sherlock Holmes, asking him to assist in tracking down Raffles. Holmes, however, telephoned that he did not intend to cooperate in this search, as he did not consider Raffles a criminal at all. So Baxter was dependent on his own mails. And thus Baxter actually did not know himself yet which way he would take in this matter. He looked through the evening paper with a dejected face. Suddenly his eyes were caught by a small advertisement. He read the following. Miss Elsa. Meeting place in front of the Majesty Theatre, tomorrow, Thursday, at 8 o'clock. Baxter read the advertisement several times. Could chance have shown him the way here? He thought. Wouldn't this miss mean his kinsman, Miss Walton? Who knows? Maybe he was on the right track. Maybe this time he outsmarted Raffles. He didn't tell Colgate about his discovery. He took a pocket knife and carefully cut out the ad. Then he bade farewell to the jeweler, and went to the Times advertising agency to ask for a description of the person who had issued the ad. He had to leave, however. Then he went to Whitechapel. It was already dark when he entered this infamous part of town. He stopped in front of a small house near the Thames. After scouring all sides to make sure no one was spying on him, he carefully opened the door. He asked, "Is Mr. Fox at home?" A woman's voice replied, "Yes, sir." The inspector went down a short corridor and into a room in which a kerosene lamp was burning. As he entered, an old, thin man rose from his armchair. He looked sharply at the detective. "Oh, is it you, Inspector Baxter? I haven't seen you in 3 months. What are you doing here?" "Affairs," replied Baxter. "I need your help, where you can earn a few £1,000s." The skinny one coughed and offered the inspector a seat. "Let me hear what business you have." Baxter paused. Then he started. "It's to do, Raffles." The skinny one let out a long whistle. Then he drummed his bony fingers on the table. "That's what I thought when I heard that reward. So it's all about Raffles. It's a great honor for me to have you enlist my help, but my dear Mr. Baxter, I'll be honest with you, that fellow is way too clever for all of us. A reward has been put on his head, such as the detectives have never promised. If only she could be earned. You know very well, Inspector, that in my 20-year career as a private detective, I have already done many difficult cases and have put many dangerous boys behind bars. But my dear Mr. Baxter, look here." He pointed to a stack of papers on the table in front of him. "There you have all the material which I have collected in the Raffles case, without my having come to any clear insight as yet. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Baxter, that the man outsmarts us all. I do not hesitate for a moment to admit this wholeheartedly. I don't agree with you. I think I've outsmarted him this time, and you, Mr. Fox, are the only one who can help me." Fox drew his face into a grimace. Yes, if the detectives can't do it on their own anymore, we can lend a hand. Then tell me what you have in mind for this Raffles and for me." Baxter pulled out the clipped ad from his wallet. Fox read her attentively. "Yeah, if that's Miss Walton who's in cahoots with Raffles, and if that's Raffles, then it could be a good deal." But he was silent for a while. Then he continued. But if it really is that sweetheart and Raffles, then what? Baxter was silent. The matter is not so easy, continued Fox. Would Raffles, when he goes to the theatre, show himself to the public? I don't believe any of that. But I will, I must find him, claimed Baxter. I wish you the best of luck, Mr. Baxter, but, with your leave, I have a very different plan. And that is? Raffles is in love with this Miss Walton, that's a fact. He has now set it up to meet her. So if tomorrow night, despite all precautions, we fail to catch Raffles in front of the playhouse, let us kidnap Miss Walton and take her somewhere. Raffles will then of course spare no effort to connect with her and free her from our hands. Baxter shook his head. That is a criminal offense, Mr. Fox. In this the end justifies the means. As early as 7 o'clock the next day, Baxter and Fox were on their way to the Majesty Theatre. It was about 8 o'clock when Baxter discovered the girl. A fine, damp drizzle fell, and the girl had wrapped her face in a dense veil. Baxter saw that she kept looking back with an uneasy gesture, as if she were waiting for someone. At this moment Fox flew toward her. He spoke to her. "It is good that you have come. Come along, you will be awaited." Miss Walton, not having the slightest suspicion, followed the private detective to an automobile waiting behind the building. Baxter remained at his post, hoping to see the expected Raffles show up. When Fox reached the automobile, he said, "Get in quickly, lest anyone notice us." These words further strengthened the girl's belief that the man had been sent by Lord Lister. Hastily she mounted the motor car, while Fox looked back to make sure no one was watching him. He saw only a policeman in uniform and, unafraid of him, called the driver the address of his house. Then he rose too. He did not, however, see the keen eye with which the policeman was watching him. The latter sauntered slowly to the main entrance of the theatre and stationed himself there near the inspector. A few seconds later he began a chat with the inspector about the bad weather and about the play being played that evening. Baxter gave only short answers and then the officer started patrolling again. The inspector barely looked at the officer. He searched keenly for the crowd, hoping to find the wanted Raffles. By 9 o'clock he grew tired of waiting. He seemed to be mistaken. Miss Walton must have been waiting for someone else. Raffles had not been to the theatre. And yet he had been there. He had even talked to him about the bad weather and the play that was being performed. The inspector had only had to reach out to arrest the wanted man. Lord Lister had come dressed as a police officer. He had also been the man who had watched the automobile and heard where the unknown man had driven with Miss Walton. Then he spoke to Charlie Brand, who was about to enter the theatre, and went with him into the adjacent street, where they soon took a cab and were driven to a boarding house. There he had rented a room and put on his uniform suit. The friends told each other their experiences. "I must find out this night what happened to Miss Walton," said Raffles. "I want to pay you a visit first to my landlady and his wife. They can then meet you and arrange a room for you for tonight. We will then leave immediately." The landlady and his wife knew absolutely nothing about the doings of their tenant. They took him, in view of his uniform, for a London policeman indeed. They greeted Charlie Brand without any suspicion. They gave him a room next to Lord Lister's. He took Charlie to his pension and against 11 o'clock in the evening the two left the house to search for Miss Walton's quarters. Lord Lister instinctively understood that a snare had been laid on the girl. After an hour of driving, they came to the private detective's house. The shutters of the house occupied by Fox were tightly shut, so that no light fell on the street. The two friends looked at the house for a while to see how best to enter it. There, Lord Lister discovered that the third house, away from Fox's home, was empty. Immediately he had a plan ready. "We will try to get through that house in the courtyard." The pair were just about to enter the empty house when the door to Fox's house opened. Two men appeared on the threshold. In one of them, Lord Lister immediately recognized Inspector Baxter. "Let's hope for the best," heard the gentleman thief say, and don't take the gag out of her mouth until she's quite calm again, otherwise she'll scream the whole neighborhood together. I'll make a quick phone call to Scotland Yard right now. Our most vigilant officers will watch the street and the house until that clever fox, that Raffles, comes here to free the girl. The main thing is and remains, asserted the private detective, that your men do not behave so conspicuously that any child can point their finger at them and say, "There's one of the guys from Scotland Yard standing there." "Don't worry," replied Baxter, "I'll make it right. Every effort will be made to make history completely successful. I am now only afraid that Raffles will fail to discover the girl's whereabouts. Just leave that to me, Mr. Baxter. I will put in the newspaper tomorrow, under the same letters as the advertisement in question, that Miss Else was unable to attend tonight. I will then ask him to come and see her here. Then when Raffles reads the advertisement, which I don't doubt for a moment, he'll walk in with his eyes open and come over here, or he'll try to get in touch with Miss Walton in some way." "All right," replied the inspector, "I am going home now. There's nothing left to do tonight anyway." "Of course not." Baxter went. Fox closed the front door. "And now we go to work, my boy," said Lord Lister to Charlie Brand. Cautiously he walked with Charlie to the empty house and opened the door without any difficulty with a key. When the door was again very carefully closed, he lit an electric flashlight and the two walked down the hall to the garden. A low wooden fence separated the plot from the adjacent. They climbed over the gate, then over a second, and then came into the garden behind Fox's house. The windows of this house were firmly shut with iron shutters, and the door could not be forced with a snare. A great iron bolt had been pushed forward from the inside. "It takes effort," Raffles said to his friend. He now took a large center drill from his inside pocket and placed it on the front door. After a while he had several holes with it drilled close together, and in a short time a hole the size of a fist had been created in the wood by means of a jigsaw. He reached through the opening and pushed back the bolt. So now the way was clear. With bated breath, Lord Lister listened to some noise. He heard sighing and crying from the first floor. The blood flew to his face. He recognized Miss Walton's voice. At the same time he heard someone walking restlessly to and fro. Again he listened intently. Then he spoke to Charlie Brand. "Someone is at home, that's the little guy who was talking to Baxter. We must first defuse it. You won't kill him, will you, Edward?" "No way. Come on now, Charlie. Put on that mask." He gave his friend a silk mask and tied one for his face as well. Inaudible like a cat, he slid up the stairs and stopped in front of the door on the first floor, behind which he heard a sound. He calculated, judging by the sound of footsteps when the walking man was back at the window, and then suddenly he burst the door, grabbed Fox in the back, threw him to the ground, and held his hands. Dismayed, the detective looked at the masked man. Then Lord Lister cried, "Tie the fellow. Here you have a good cord." He produced a hand bow and tossed it to Charlie. This bound the terrified detective. Then Lord Lister made a wad of a piece of paper and put it in the man's mouth. "I heard," he said to Fox, "that you were trying to lure me into this house by a false advertisement. I am so grateful to you for that I have come already." Then he rushed out of the room and made his way to the room, where he heard Miss Walton's lamentations. The detective had tied her up and she lay helpless on the carpet in the middle of the room. Startled, she looked at the sharp light of the lantern. Was someone there again who wanted to harm her? Hastily Raffles ripped off his mask and called her name in a clear tone. The girl thought she was dreaming. Raffles lifted her with his strong arms, cut the ropes and removed the gag from her mouth. "Is it you?" was the first thing she could say. "Yes, it's me. I arrived just in time to thwart some villainy. Come with me, dear, you are safe and saved now." Suddenly she began to laugh. "You look like a police officer. I would never have recognized you." "Come now, child," he insisted, "we must not lose any time here in the house. She got up and went with him to the room where the gagged Mr. Fox lay. "Good evening," laughed Lord Lister. "When your friends come from Scotland Yard you must give them my regards from John C. Raffles." Then the trio left. The next morning there was a great commotion at Fox's house. Workers began to break up the pavement. A fruit peddler stood there with his cart, and no one suspected in these people the disguised officers of Scotland Yard. Towards evening came Detective Mahome, who had been sent by Baxter. He knocked and yelled at the front door, but it wouldn't open. Then he began to get worried and fetched a blacksmith. The latter wanted to open the door and then noticed that it was not closed at all. Concerned, Mahome entered. Several detectives followed him. Soon Fox was found and freed from his predicament. Then he spoke to Mahome with a bitter laugh. "I have now tried once more to help you against Raffles. You see what consequences that has had for me. He's quicker than all of us put together, and if you write out £100,000 reward, I'll take no part in it." He stretched out his limbs and sat down at the table. "I'm going to eat something, because I'm starving," and heedless of the detectives, he sat down at the table and, with great hunger, began to eat large portions of bread and meat, which was still there from the previous evening. The Scotland Yard detectives stood around him in silence. They didn't understand the incoherent story. Mahome looked gloomy. Fox was on his sixth sandwich. The detectives looked and were silent. Some time later Baxter came with Colgate. One of the detectives had told the inspector what had happened by telephone. The jeweler had brought this one. When Baxter was told the whole story in full detail by Fox, a telegram was sent to him. Baxter opened it. His face turned pale. "That Raffles treats me like an idiot," he scolded. "He is sending me another telegram to congratulate me on the successful outcome." Furious, he crumpled the paper. "Do not laugh. I forbid you." He bit Mahome. This one bit his laugh, although it took him the greatest effort. Again Scotland Yard had pulled out all the stops, and yet again Raffles had escaped. And Mahome was not allowed to laugh. Chapter 4. At home. Lord Lister's house in Regent Park was guarded by Fred, his valet, who awoke suddenly from his slumber to the bell being pulled violently. Fred waited a few minutes. There was shouting again. The old man dressed and whispered, "That must be my master." He hurried down the stairs, opened the front door and let 3 people in. "Good evening, Fred," said Lord Lister, and shook his hand. In a cheerful tone the old man returned the greeting, and the faithful servant took the right hand that had been offered to him. John Raffles was still dressed as a policeman, and was recognized by the old servant only by his voice. "I'm bringing a visitor, Fred," said the lord. "Is the guest room ready?" The valet bowed and replied, "All the rooms are in order, Lord, so that they may be occupied at any moment." "You are a faithful soul," said his master, "and I hope, as we have not yet had evening bread, that you will be able to provide us with a cold supper and a cup of tea." The valet bowed again and replied, "With pleasure, Lord." Now Charlie Brand shook his hand too. He wouldn't have recognized it either, if Charlie hadn't addressed him. Only Miss Walton appeared before the old man in her usual form. He went up the stairs and turned on the light in the study. Everything there was unchanged, and it looked as if Lord Lister had never been away. The fire in the hearth was burning. There was a pleasant warmth in the room, and cigarettes lay ready for use on the smoking table. Lord Lister and Miss Walton laughed as they thought of the last flight in the trunk. In their merry mood they did not think of the possibility that any danger might threaten the house. Only Charlie Brand was restless and wished 1,000 miles from London. "Why did we even come here? I don't feel comfortable," said the young man. "We are safer here than anywhere else," claimed Lord Lister. "Are you so sure of that?" "Very sure." "I hope you are right." "I hope so too." "What would you do if the detectives from Scotland Yard found us here?" asked Charlie Brand. "Go away. Lord Lister replied calmly. "It's easy for you to talk," said Charlie Brand with a shrug, looking around the room. "I'd like to know how you'd like to do that. You can no longer work with your sliding door and your clock, which you can crawl into your bathroom. And the trick with the suitcase is old too. The detectives know your tricks. I'll find other ways out when the time comes, Charlie." "I'm still burning with curiosity to know how you're going to build that," said Charlie. Lord Lister went up to him, patted him encouragingly on the shoulder, and said, "You are nervous, dear boy. I rack my brains about such things first, when the time comes. Now I am very hungry for the first time, and I hope with all my heart that my old one has something to eat." Miss Walton had gone to the dining room to set the table. A moment later the trio sat laughing gleefully at the well-provided table, and no mortal in all London could have guessed that the most brilliant of thieves, the king of burglars, the infamous Raffles, was supping leisurely in his own house, while all the detectives from London were hunting him. Old Fred served his master and his guests with calm dignity. The old man beamed with joy, and when the meal was over Lord Lister presented him with a glass of champagne and thanked him for the faithful service he had always rendered. "Drink that glass, Fred, to my bride's health, Miss Else Walton." The champagne glass trembled in the old man's hands, and a glowing red covered his face. He was ashamed that his master should speak to him so intimately. But at the same time it also stroked his sense of honor and his pride. "I thank your lordship very warmly for the great honor, and I wish you all the happiness that heaven can bestow upon you." He didn't know what he would do. Again and again he bowed, and he would have nodded and bowed, if Lord Lister had not lightly seized him by the shoulder and said, "Run with him, Else," encouraged Lord Lister. Miss Walton, however, put the glass down. She went to the old servant and kissed him on the forehead. Old Fred was so dazed that the glass fell from his hand. His faithful eyes were filled with tears. "And now, very quickly, get a room ready for my bride, Fred. Mr. Brand can sleep on the couch in my study," said Raffles. "What are you up to?" asked Charlie. "First rest here in the house for a few days and then perhaps visit jeweler Colgate again. Don't push things too far, Edward." "Do you know what I would do? I would go with Miss Walton to some quiet corner of the earth and be happy there together. Are you still not tired of your present life? To follow your advice, my boy, money is needed. I don't have a cent. What could I live on in peace? And I know that my bride likes to share this life with me." Miss Walton threw her arms around his neck and whispered, "Yes, dear. Since I know that you only steal from bad people what they steal from others, and since I have experienced how unmerciful those people are to the poor, I admire you and will do whatever you ask of me." Lord Lister kissed her. "Tomorrow you must go to your mother and tell her that you are going on a journey for a while. And now, rest well, dear." Thereupon Lord Lister, too, retired, as did Charlie Brand. A few minutes later, the house lay as if deserted. The next morning Raffles read the morning papers. He had to laugh heartily. And with him all London laughed. For the umpteenth time Scotland Yard had been fooled. In the afternoon of the same day a carriage stopped in front of Dr. Sandrowski's mental hospital in West End. An elderly naval officer and a young lady got out. The officer identified himself as Captain of the Sea, Lord Douglas, the younger lady being his wife. "We have a cousin in our family," said the officer, "who has all kinds of delusions from time to time. He claimed for some time to be Raffles, and now he says he is a Colgate jeweler. We wish to bring this cousin here for a while." The doctor had listened carefully. Then he declared to Lord Douglas that the sick man could come the next day at 11 o'clock for examination. The visitors went. The evening of the same day, Colgate received a letter from Dr. Sandrowski requesting him to come to him at noon the following day. The doctor wished to sell some stones, and had no time to come personally. Colgate, the neurologist's name, was well known. The next day, about 11 o'clock, Lord Douglas came to Dr. Sandrowski and handed him a box of jewels. "In an hour," he said, "my cousin will be here. I have told him that you want to sell him some jewels. As you know, he imagines himself to be the jeweler Colgate. Don't give him the stones for a small price." "Of course not," smiled the doctor. "Nervous patients usually calculate with large numbers. But why should the sale be organized with your cousin?" "That you may better know the nature of his illness." "Excellent," the doctor stated. The servant at this moment served the jeweler, and Captain Douglas retired to the adjoining room. Jeweler Colgate entered, greeted the doctor warmly, and shook his hand. "Sit down," said the doctor, noting to himself that the jeweler's facial muscles were convulsing nervously every moment. "You are very nervous, as I see," began Dr. Sandrovsky. "I am," replied the jeweler. "That Raffles story has really upset me. I will not rest till I have the fellow." Dr. Sandrovsky made some notes. It was already clear to him that the man was incurably insane. "You sent for me," began the supposed patient, "because you wanted to sell me some jewels." "Certainly," replied the doctor. He opened the box that was on the table next to him. "Are those the stones?" "Yes." The jeweler looked at them. "These are so-called white diamonds, but they are not of the purest water. I'll offer you £1,000 for it." "That is quite cheap. I cannot give them for less than £2,000. After a little talking back and forth, he handed the doctor a check for this amount. The doctor picked up the paper with a smile and then said, "Please wait here a few moments." "My time is limited," replied Colgate, going to pack the diamonds. The doctor pressed a secret button on the desk, which alerted some of the nurses in the adjoining room. Colgate did not understand all this story, and, astonished at the doctor's demeanor, suddenly some attendants entered the room and dragged Colgate away. At the same instant Lord Douglas appeared. "How are you, doctor?" "I'm sorry, the man is incurable." "May I see the check he fabricated?" "Certainly, here she is." Lord Douglas shook his head. "He did sign them with Colgate's name," he said, putting the paper in his wallet. Then he asked the doctor when he might come and see his nephew. "Usually 3 days pass before the first showers of rage cease. So you must not come to see your nephew before Monday." Lord Douglas left, and the doctor went to the cell in which the jeweler was locked. This one ran like crazy. The doctor looked through the peephole and said to the nurse, "Give him a good jet of cold water." Thus it happened. Some orderlies sprayed the furious and raging jeweler from all sides with a cold shower, and then put him to bed. Towards evening Dr. Sandrovsky went to see the patient, but when he got to his bedside the jeweler was at his throat and wanted to strangle him. Again several nurses were needed to keep Colgate in bed, and as he continued to beat around himself, a straitjacket was put on him. The so-called Lord Douglas, meanwhile, had been paid £2,000 in the bank when he had presented the cheque. He took a car and drove near Regent Park. There he alighted and entered Lord Lister's house. In the hallway he took off his beard and wig and spoke to Charlie Brand. "I believe our friend Colgate is getting a jet of cold water at this moment." Then he went to his study and prepared himself to travel. At Queensborough he wanted to embark with Charlie and his bride for Germany. Miss Walton had travelled the day before to see her mother first. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon the three met on board the ship. At the same hour, Inspector Baxter was delivered a telegram containing the following. Inspector of Detective Baxter, Scotland Yard. I brought jeweler Colgate into Dr. Sandrovsky's mental hospital. He can make up his mind there. Next time I hope to take you there, for I believe you need something like that too. By the way, I believe that jeweler Colgate's cure will be over when you receive this telegram, and that he will never again in his life sell false diamonds to Lord Lister. Otherwise I swear revenge again. Yours faithfully, John C. Raffles. The end. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.